is joining me now to talk more about this. So, Caroline, what are you hearing?
Yeah, it sounds like, Vlad, yesterday they were at that standstill about the RICO conspiracy charge. The judge yesterday administered this Allen charge, telling them really to try harder to come up with a verdict on at least that one count. We knew that they had reached unanimity with respect to counts 2 through 5. But, if they have a verdict, it means somebody changed their mind, or some of these jurors, talked with each other and came around. If it is that they simply can't come to an agreement, that would be an official mixed verdict, a split verdict, and the judge could declare a mistrial on that one charge.
And so, how soon could we actually learn the details of this verdict?
Really soon. If the jury has sent a note saying that they've reached a verdict, we'll have to verify that. The judge will read it, but then I would expect very, very soon, any moment now.
All right. Stand by for just a moment, Caroline. I want to bring in CBS News national correspondent Jerika Duncan, who's been covering this trial from the very beginning and is joining me from outside the courthouse now. Jerika, what are you hearing?
Well, we just saw the Combs family go in, his children, this within the last 5 to 10 minutes. And then, of course, Alice Gaynor, who is a CBS reporter, is inside. And she literally put in bold letters and caps at 10:05, 3 minutes ago, the verdict is in. Then there were people outside screaming that the verdict is in. So word is spreading very quickly, and we expect to know more in reference to that count 1 charge, because that was what the jury appeared to be hung up on yesterday. We don't know the results yet, but as you just mentioned, we will likely find out here very soon. So I'm just following the notes from inside. Our court reporter that's in there, Alice Gaynor from WCBS. And as soon as we have more details, Vlad, about the results of the verdict, we'll definitely bring them to you. But just to sort of recap, this trial has been going on we're in the 8th week. 8 men and 4 women making the decision about Sean Diddy Combs' fate, 55-year-old music mogul. For people who don't know what that means and who he is or what he represents, this is someone who was part of a partnership with one of the largest alcoholic beverages, Diageo. But beyond that, he had a clothing line. He was obviously known for his music. He started Bad Boy Records back in 1993. His first major artist was Christopher Wallace, known as the Notorious B.I.G. And it seemed like after his death, Christopher Wallace, Combs' career really catapulted. He won his first of 3 Grammys with a tribute song to Christopher Wallace. But this is someone with a rags to riches story. We've talked about it on this broadcast here on streaming. But that is why I think this is so significant. He had so much and was literally on top of the world. And now we will find out just what the jury decides here. I'm also getting word from just another source inside that there is a verdict. So we're working to find out the details, because that's what everybody is waiting for. It's one thing to know that they reached a verdict yesterday in 4 of the 5 counts. Now we want to know what the results are of their decision.
All right, Jerika, just stand by for just a moment while you continue to look at your phone and see the reporting from our Alice Gaynor, who's actually inside the courtroom. I want to, while you're refreshing your phone, I want to bring back Caroline Polisi to talk a little bit about the charges, Caroline, that we just put up on the screen there. And yesterday, you and I were having a conversation on CBS Mornings about those specific charges. And in particular, you zeroed in on the sex trafficking. And you made an excellent point on our show when you described what lay people imagine when they think of sex trafficking is people that are trafficked across international lines from poor or developing countries into Western countries. But you really had the legal definition of what that means, and you put it in terms that people could understand, which could be simply, in the case of a boyfriend and girlfriend, both consenting individuals who could find themselves in similar hot water. Can you just break that down for our viewers?
Yeah, that's right. I think the prosecution had an uphill battle here in terms of what we colloquially think of as sex trafficking, as organized crime, racketeering crimes, things like that. They have presented evidence that could lead the jury to find that they proved every element of sex trafficking. All that is required to prove the sex trafficking is this element of force, fraud, or coercion. And the force and fraud and the coercion does not necessarily need to involve physical force. And the coercion can be threats or fear of physical harm, but also fear of financial harm, fear of reputational harm. Remember, he videotaped all of these encounters. Another really important point that prosecution made was that it only has to be one time, right? Out of all of these freak-offs, there only has to be one in which he coerced either Cassie and or Jane into the freak-off or hotel nights or whatever they're being called by force, fraud, or coercion. So this is why, the defense in their closing, Mark Agnifilo really said, this is a tale of two trials. It's how you see this, right? So they want to zoom out. They called this he called it a great love story. This was these were relationships plagued by domestic violence, plagued by drug abuse, but it was not sex trafficking. It was not a RICO conspiracy. So really trying to reframe that for jurors to think about it in a different way.
So just sort of, I know we're as we await the actual verdict, Caroline, the fact Tony DeCopel today on CBS Mornings wondered if the fact that yesterday they had reached a verdict in 4 of the 5 charges meant that it would not potentially go well for Sean Diddy Combs. In other words, that they had already decided what they knew about those 4, and they had questions about the 5th, and that could portend a guilty verdict across the board. How do you see that when you just know a little bit about what happens in deliberation rooms?
Yeah, it's really complicated. There are so many ways this could go, so I'm hesitant to make a prediction. However, I would just note those 4 counts, 2 counts of sex trafficking with respect to Jane and Cassie, 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution with respect to Jane and Cassie. Those are predicate crimes for the RICO conspiracy. In other words, they only have to find that he engaged or agreed with somebody else to attempt these 2 RICO or racketeering predicate crimes. And then the additional element there is the enterprise. So I suspect they may be hung up on this enterprise element. It's a really amorphous enterprise. They're not alleging it's bad boy entertainment or some sort of corporation in law. It's a conspiracy and an enterprise in fact that they're alleging. And it's Sean Combs is at the helm. He is the mastermind, and it's his chief of staff that is carrying out some of these directives, and then his bodyguards that are helping him cover up these crimes. And so in order for the jury to convict on RICO, they have to buy into this idea that there was a pattern or practice that everybody agreed to and that it was all for a common goal.
All right, Caroline, stand by. Let's go back to Jerika Duncan, who's outside the courthouse right here in Lower Manhattan. Jerika, you've got some new information to share.
Yeah, we just heard that Combs walked in, that he said something to his family. He put his glasses on and is sitting down now. Prosecutors sitting with their arms folded. And this is probably the most important note. That just came down a minute ago. The judge said that the note from the jurors said, we have reached a verdict on all counts. We have reached a verdict on all counts. So now we get the process of the judge deciding what's next. Says judge reminds people to maintain order. He asks the deputies to get the jury. The jury will come out. The foreperson will read what they have found, and we will report that to you as soon as we get that information. But they have reached a verdict on all counts. This is interesting to me because we talked about this morning, Vlad, those words, unpersuadable opinions. We didn't know how many people perhaps these jurors were not in agreement on the counts regarding the racketeering conspiracy, but literally they started deliberating at 9 o'clock this morning. We expected that maybe they would deliberate for a couple of hours or at least 2 or 3 hours. But in fact, they got here at 9 o'clock this morning, and at 9:52 a.m., according to the judge and according to that note, they reached a verdict on all counts. So
all right, Jerika Duncan for us. Stand by, Jerika, because we're going to go to a CBS News.
What was going on in that room? What was the difference maker for why they decided to reach a verdict on all counts within a matter of less than an hour?
Yeah, Jerika, sorry for that. We were told that there was a special report happening. They popped up the graphic, and so you were covered a little bit for that moment. But we could still hear what you were saying. So we're just reminding our viewers that there will be a special report. When that special report happens, I will toss it to you. No doubt, Jerika, you will be a part of that special report. But until then, let me just ask you about
I am not hearing Vlad's programming, but I'm hearing.
All right. A lot of gremlins today while we try to figure this out. Let's go to, is it Caroline or is it Chris? Let's go to Chris Melcher, who's a celebrity lawyer and former sex crimes defense attorney. Chris, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. Do we have a camera on you?
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Tony DeCopel in New York, where a jury has reached a verdict in the sex trafficking trial of Sean Diddy Combs. That verdict, expected to be read shortly in court, comes after 2 days of jury deliberations. Last night, we had learned the jury did reach a partial verdict, saying they could not agree on the first count. In total, to refresh people's memories, Combs faces 5 federal charges, including 1 count of racketeering conspiracy, 2 counts of sex trafficking, and 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. Combs has denied guilt and pleaded not guilty in all these counts. The defense has accused the prosecution of being overzealous and of exaggerating details of Combs' life, saying this case is really about his personal drug use and a swinger lifestyle. The trial has lasted 7 weeks, more than, in fact. 34 witness testimonies were involved, and prosecutors argued that the 55-year-old rapper and producer was the leader of what they call a criminal enterprise that had forced women into engaging in abusive sex acts with male prostitutes. This is a federal case, so we do not have cameras or electronics permitted in the courtroom during the proceedings. However, CBS News' New York's Alice Gaynor is one of the few reporters who have been allowed in the courthouse with a computer. She'll be providing us with some real-time updates as she watches from an overflow room as the verdict is read, and we will take you to that when we have it. For now, though, Jerika Duncan is outside the court. She's been following this case for all of those 7 weeks that it's been ongoing. Jerika, good to see you. What's the mood? What are you hearing from where you are?
There are people yelling out a potential verdict, the result. We are not going to report that just yet. The last note that I got from Alice Gaynor, who is inside the courtroom, was at 10:15. The judge said, "All rise," and that the jury was being let in. Let's talk about the jury there for a moment. 8 men and 4 women, at least 5 people of color. This is a very diverse jury, and they have been listening to testimony for the last 8 weeks, 7 weeks of testimony, and obviously deliberating in this last week here, the 8th week. But they have heard from 34 witnesses, and 2 key witnesses that are part of this indictment, part of the charges, were Jane, a pseudonym that was used for an ex-girlfriend that he dated from 2021 to 2024, and Cassie Ventura, truly the star witness in all of this. She was with Combs for about 11 years. She said that she met him when she was 19 years old, was signed to his record label, but talked to the jurors and gave her testimony about being abused and saying that she did not want to partake in what Combs called freak-offs, where he would watch her have sex with escorts. She was on the stand for 4 days, and Jane was on the stand for 6 days. So the jurors got a lot of information. They saw videos of both women engaged in sex acts that were not available to the public. They saw images of Cassie, her bruised body, emails and text messages that the defense would say tell 2 different stories, and they maintained that there were 2 trials happening. Mark Agnifilo, the lead defense attorney, saying this was a modern-day love story, but the government begging to differ and say this isn't even about a love story. This is about a crime. We're just getting word not guilty on count 1, not guilty on count 2. Is that correct?
Guilty on count 3.
Guilty on count 3. Stay with me, Tony.
Not guilty on count 4.
Not guilty on count 4.
And guilty on count 5.
And guilty on count 5. This is just coming into us right now. Could you repeat that for me, Nia? She's our field producer. You said not guilty on count 1.
Count 1.
That is the racketeering conspiracy. The second count.
Not guilty.
not guilty on count 2. Is that correct? Not guilty.
Alice, guilty on count 3.
Guilty on count 3. That would be the Mann Act transportation of Cassie Ventura. And if you could, looks like I have the note as well, so I'm just going to read it. Count 1, racketeering conspiracy, not guilty. Count 2, not guilty. Count 3, guilty. Count 4, not guilty. Count 5, guilty. So essentially, the jurors found that he was guilty of the Mann Act. That is the transportation to engage in prostitution, but they found him not guilty on sex trafficking, very serious charge there where he could have spent a minimum of 15 years in prison, and not guilty on that racketeering conspiracy, which he could have spent up to life in prison for. So that is the very latest. We're going to get more information as things are coming out in terms of the mood inside that courtroom. What is Sean Combs doing? What is his family doing? What are the jurors doing? How are they reacting? All of that should be coming to us momentarily. But again, if you're just tuning in, Sean Combs not guilty on the most serious of charges, the racketeering conspiracy and sex trafficking.
All right, Jerika, thank you very much. With us also is criminal defense attorney Caroline Polisi, a CBS News legal contributor. Caroline, this is a mixed result, and we do have a bit of color from the courtroom from our Alice Gaynor. Combs, just before the verdict was read, walked in, said something to his family, and then put his glasses on. If you could, please put yourself in the position of this defense team and Mr. Combs. How would they be feeling here with 2 guilties? And I should mention they carry potential sentences of 0 to 10 years. So he could be facing criminal prison time at this point. Put me into their mindset right now. How are they feeling about this result?
They are high-fiving each other. This is a huge win for the defense. These transportation to engage in prostitution counts, Mann Act counts, don't have a mandatory minimum. Given his prior history, he doesn't have any prior convictions. He could get away with time served, even a couple of years. I mean, this is one of the best possible outcomes that they could have hoped for. You know, the sex trafficking and the RICO conspiracy, that means the jury was buying what the defense was selling in terms of this overarching theme that this was not coercion for sex, that these 2 women, Cassie and the woman with the pseudonym Jane, that they entered into these relationships knowingly, that they made a cost-benefit analysis to engage in these acts, and that there really wasn't coercion, whether that was in the form of financial harm. Remember, we heard about him sort of hanging over Jane's head that he paid her rent, or whether that was, I mean, we all saw that 2016 Intercontinental Hotel video of him beating Cassie, apparently, in the midst of a freak-off. So even that wasn't enough for the jurors to overcome that hurdle. I think this is a huge deal. The prosecution had been sort of critiqued for maybe overcharging this case. I think it shows that it was. And the fact that they came back quickly after that modified Allen charge that was administered yesterday with that not guilty on the RICO charge shows you how quickly they got there. So huge win for the defense.
Caroline, thank you very much. I want to bring in Jessica Levinson, also a CBS News legal contributor and a Loyola Law School professor. Her work focuses on constitutional law, election law, and the Supreme Court. She's one of our best analysts. Jessica, how are you feeling about this result? We just heard about potential high fives from Caroline's perspective. How would you feel about this result if you were sitting in the Diddy camp right now?
Exactly the same as Caroline would. Excellent analysis as always. This is a big win for the defense. It shows that the prosecution was able to get guilty on the most straightforward of the cases, of the counts. But when it comes to those more complicated counts that we've all had the opportunity to talk about now for months, whether or not Sean Combs really had created this criminal enterprise, whether or not the freak-offs crossed that line from maybe morally questionable or seriously questionable to illegal. I think that's where things broke down for the prosecution. It shows that these are complicated cases to bring, that not every federal case that's brought is a slam dunk winner. And certainly, I think there will be kind of Monday morning quarterbacking of, should this have been charged differently? I think they presented all the facts they could have, but moving this from there was immoral, unethical behavior to this was a criminal enterprise to the tune of a racketeering charge, that's a really high hill to climb, and we're seeing that this morning.
Jessica, the public is going to be very interested in whether this very famous man goes to prison or not. The two guilty verdicts carry potential punishments of up to 10 years, but as Caroline pointed out, they also have no mandatory minimum. It could be 0 years. Do we have any sense at this early date of where in the range of things he could fall?
So we're going to look, the prosecution and the defense will both submit sentencing memorandum. They will make their argument to the judge. The judge will have discretion to say, I think X is appropriate. I clerked for a federal judge, and he used to tell me, when we went back, he said, it's within my discretion. If I want to give a big bear hug and say, no, go be a good citizen, I can do so. I don't think we're going to see that in this case, but I think some prison time could absolutely be on the table, again, given everything that we've heard in this case.
All right, Jessica, thank you very much. Let's go back to Jerika Duncan outside the courthouse. I've been following this from the very beginning, and she's with Elaine Quijano, who we're going to talk to in a moment. But, Jerika, what are you hearing outside the courthouse? It's been kind of a circus out there. People have a lot of opinions.
Yeah.
What's the scene like now?
Right now, people are yelling. There are quite a few Combs supporters that have been outside, a lot of content creators. But I'm hearing from Alice Gaynor inside the courtroom that Combs, quote, pumped his fist at one point, and he put his head up to the sky with prayer hands. So that is his reaction moments after hearing that mixed verdict. Also something to note, the Southern District of New York has I believe, 99% conviction rate. So for this to happen, a big win really for Combs in terms of a best possible outcome. But now we find out if the federal courts will continue prosecuting him on those charges, those counts that he was found not guilty for. But Elaine Quijano, you were in the overflow room where you can see the reaction from family. I know it was very tense in there. Describe what was going on.
So just to give our viewers a sense, basically where we were was a couple of floors down from the actual courtroom itself, as you know. And what you see there are windows into that courtroom. So you have a camera that is not quite a head-on, but it does give you the perspective of what it looks like from sort of the front of the room.
Right.
So
when I was
could
sitting
see
in
him.
the courtroom, you see the profile and you're in the back.
So
but you're seeing Combs, you're seeing the attorneys, you can't see the jurors, of course.
Right.
But you can see the family, who are usually in the second row.
That's right. So what we saw, it was interesting. I'll just sort of set the scene. As the jurors were coming in, it was interesting to watch Sean Combs, before the jurors were brought in, was seated at the defense table, as you said, a couple of rows up from where his family was. But he appeared to be looking through a notebook. He had reading glasses on, I noticed, and he was intently staring at either a book or notebook, flipping through it in his lap. Then, when the jurors were brought into the room, he immediately turned, looked at them, and when the verdict came, that very first count of not guilty, he put his hand to his head, his right hand, just like this, and clearly seemed to be relieved. At that point, we also watched as the other counts were read, and at one point we could see him squeezing the hands of his defense attorneys. The defense attorneys had their arms around each other, sort of side-hugging each other, and then we watched as Sean Combs turned towards that row where his family was sitting and did a prayer hand gesture like this and turned back towards the front of the room.
And Elaine, that is something that I saw throughout this trial. He would always look at his family, touch his chest, pray, prayer hands, smile. He was very engaged throughout this trial. There were moments where he would be writing notes to his attorneys when there were certain witnesses on the stand, maybe perhaps to help his defense, if you will. But he's been engaged. He's been very expressive. In fact, he got in trouble at one point because the judge felt like he was being a little too expressive and didn't want that to be something that the jurors were considering as opposed to the facts.
Yes. One more thing I just want wanted to note, at the same time this was taking place, I was also watching where 2 rows up from where Sean Combs was sitting, as you know, is the prosecutor's table.
Yes.
And there, the row of prosecutors had a much different posture. They had, for the most part, hands on the table, shoulders a bit slumped. I noticed many of them, their gaze seemed to be focused down towards the table as these verdicts, as the verdict was being read. So it was interesting to see that contrast.
I mean, we're talking about thousands of pages of emails, of text messages, 34 witnesses that were called, 8 weeks. As the judge said at the beginning, this trial will last somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks. There was even a possibility of it going into next week if they could not reach a verdict today or perhaps tomorrow. But this has been a trying time, I think, for both sides. And what has also been interesting, Elaine, is to watch how friendly the defense and the prosecutors have been when they're not arguing, when they're not debating on behalf of their client, on behalf of the government.
Yeah, one last thing I'll note as well, just from my time short time ago being in that room, observing the scene there, I'm told that this was perhaps the most full that overflow room has been. There were a number of members of not just the media, but just the general public who decided to come and take a look at what was happening. So they had to be audibly shushed by the court official who was in the overflow room because they were so vocal and there was so much emotion just in the overflow room.
I want to read a note that just came in from Alice Gaynor. Again, she's in the courtroom. She's able to use her phone. She said not in the courtroom where this is taking place, but in another courtroom where she can also see what's going on. But the defense is arguing he wants him released and able to return to his Miami home on Star Island. His plane has been chartered. It is in Miami. He does not have access to his plane. This is his first conviction, they said. He should be released. His entire family is here. Again, this is coming from the defense. Any of them can sign on to a bond. The judge said your proposal, we leave this courtroom and we walk outside. Defense says this is Mark Agnifalo's proposal. Yes, I know there are things marshals have to do to be permitted to walk out, but they're proposing for him to leave now. Judge says application is for $1 million bond secured by 3 people. Defense says that's correct. Judge says he has relinquished his passport, asking the question. Defense says we'll give him pre-trial services. We want him to be able to go to Florida, Los Angeles, and New York. The government, to be expected, opposes this application. Remember, Sean Combs was arrested back in September of 2024 and has been behind bars ever since because he was denied bail a couple of times when trying to be with his family, when trying to wait until the trial as to whether or not he would be behind bars. A question that I'm unclear of, and maybe Caroline Polisi could answer this, because he does have the conviction on the Mann Act for both Cassie. Excuse me. I just want to make sure I get that right. For Cassie Ventura, how does that work? Because he was found guilty, and will he really be able to leave, as the defense is suggesting he should be able to?
Drika, I'll pick that up right there and bring it to Caroline. As Drika pointed out, Caroline, Mr. Combs has been in custody since 2024. I see a bank of microphones being set up, cameras being set up. Someone's going to address the public here. Are we living in a world where Sean Combs himself could quickly walk through those doors, or is this application for his release going to take a while?
It will take a while if he is released. So, as Jerika noted, he's been incarcerated pending the outcome of this trial. And any time he spent behind bars would count towards any potential sentencing. If he had been charged merely with those 2 Mann Act violations, he would have been out on bond pending this trial. So I think that, there is a good argument to be made that perhaps he should, as they noted, go to pretrial services, work out an issue, work out conditions on how he can, travel and or where he can be. It's not a crazy application. So, but yeah, he would have to go through certain, the question by the judge you're asking me for him to walk out here now was, I think, a bit sarcastic, because there does have to be some procedures involved. But I don't know if the judge will grant bail, I think that would be a good indicator on how you might see the sentencing go. You know, this sentencing is really up in the air. He has no prior offenses, which puts him in the lowest category for calculating those guidelines. What you'll see is each side proposing a sentence based on those guidelines. Pretrial services will do an interview. They will assess sort of mitigating and aggravating factors. I'm sure the defense will argue a lot of mitigating factors, including that he may have been addicted to drugs at the time, which should be a mitigating factor. That, you know, this is not necessarily, again, in the heartland of a Mann Act violation. The jury has adjudicated him not guilty of force, fraud, or coercion, so they can argue that there wasn't force, fraud, or coercion involved in the transportation to engage in prostitution. So I do think we will get some jail time here, but that does not necessarily mean that he should remain in jail pending sentencing.
You know, Caroline, the money and power, the reality of money and power has hung around this case, and there's reference in this argument from Mr. Combs' lawyers about his plane being chartered and ready to go in Miami. They seem pretty optimistic that if he doesn't get out today, as you say, because there's a process, it's going to be happening soon. Do you think their optimism is well-founded?
I think it's founded. As I said before, this is a huge win for the defense. There is an argument to be made. Look, he's been acquitted of the most serious charges, one of which included witness tampering. And that was a big, remember, for the bond hearing, a big argument that the government made to keep him behind bars was this potential for witness tampering. We don't have that anymore. There's been an adjudication on this case. He's not going to tamper with any witnesses. I think the defense does have a strong argument to let him out pending the sentencing. And sentencing is going to, you know, they'll set a date for sentencing. It's going to be, you know, a big deal in terms of what the government is asking for. But, you know, I think the government has to have their tail between their legs. This is just a huge loss for them. They went out on a limb, and the jury, you know, saw it the way the defense saw it, which is that this is a domestic violence case. These are isolated incidents of a personal nature. It's personal drug use. It's not a racketeering conspiracy. So I think we'll likely see him get out
pretty soon. Caroline, thank you very much. I want to go back to Jerika. Jerika, I understand you have more color from inside the courtroom from Alice.
In reference to that exact question that I had, the government is saying that Combs committed a litany of crimes, even when he was in incarceration, that he should not be freed until sentencing. They said the convictions here and standards suggest, Your Honor, should be detaining him until sentencing. But the judge then says, well, we're not going to resolve this in this second, but we will resolve it while we're here. He said we need to look at the statutes. The government, do you have an example where there's been a pretrial detention based solely on the Mann Act violation? So that is an indication that there is some discourse happening about whether or not Combs, just from a standpoint legally, should be released. And we have another note. Thank you so much, Elaine, because all of this is happening right now. It says government is saying it's going to be seeking lengthy prison sentence. Judge asked both sides how long they can put together a letter on this issue. Government asked for a few hours. The judge says, I think that makes sense. Mr. Agnifilo, I know you're Mr. Combs. I know Mr. Combs does not want to go back to the MDC, the detention center where he's been held since September. Combs shakes his head no and raises his prayer hands. Judge says we'll convene in the afternoon. We are adjourned until then. I will notify parties. So essentially the government is saying give us time to put together our proposal, and then we can make a decision about whether or not he should be free. So will Sean Combs walk out of the federal courthouse today? That is the question. And we, of course, will continue to follow it to see what happens. But that sounds like it's a possibility.
Wow. Every hour that he remains in custody must be agonizing for him, Jerika. Thank you very much. I want to go to Jessica Levinson, a constitutional law scholar, professor at Loyola Marymount. Jessica, the split decision is fascinating to me here. Guilty on some counts, not guilty on others. It feels like it speaks to the care the jury may have taken in going through these charges and weighing the evidence. How rare is this sort of split, and what does it tell you?
not. And it tells me that jurors do exactly what you just said. I'm going to pick up on that word. They use care. That when they go back into that box and they start, or into that room and they start deliberating, that they take their jobs very seriously. Tony, you and I always have conversations on big, high-profile cases. How can you get a fair jury in this case? How can you get a fair trial? And the answer is that once you go through the process of selecting those jurors, once they sit through the trial, they've heard all of the arguments and all of the evidence and all of the testimony, that they do tend to do exactly this. They go count by count. They look separately at each piece of evidence, and they don't just make this kind of gestalt, well, we think he's a bad guy, so guilty on everything. So I think that we should have faith in the jury system, that this is often what happens. We often see guilty on some, not guilty on others, or they can't reach a verdict on other counts because, again, jurors do take their jobs very seriously, once, particularly in a criminal case that's this of this magnitude, where they know that potentially somebody could be in prison for the rest of his life.
You know, Jessica, human nature being what it is, if you put yourself in the shoes of Mr. Combs, all of these months incarcerated, all these months in custody, waiting for a result, now he has it. These final hours must be so hard to process.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, we have so much reporting from big, high-profile criminal cases and the types that, frankly, we don't talk about, the types that don't make the news, where it's just agony at the end when the jury's deliberating, when your fate, and truly the question of whether or not you will ever see the light of day, is in the hands of those 12 jurors. And we had a little sense of what was going on yesterday, where they were able to reach a verdict on some of the counts. We knew that there was robust discussion. We knew that there was the possibility, again, of what we've been talking about, this split verdict, and we knew they were going count by count. But yes, for him, it had to feel like time had just slowed down for these last few hours.
Yeah. Caroline Polisi, we still have you here. Jerika had touched on how diverse this jury was. What does that tell you about the result, and any other color from inside those deliberations?
Yeah, look, I personally am going to be fascinated if any news outlets can get any of those jurors to give interviews. I think likely we will get that. And then, you know, jury deliberations are secret for a reason, and they're sacrosanct. We want them to be able to engage in robust discussions. But we got a little bit of color based on some of those notes. Remember that first day, there was a note saying that there was one juror who could not follow the judge's instructions. Somehow they got over that. We never know how. I would like to understand how they got over that. Additionally, at the end of the day yesterday, they said there were some jurors with, quote, unpersuadable views on this case. Now, what happened in the, essentially an hour that they took to deliberate this morning to persuade those jurors? So I think those are the types of things that certainly in all the cases I try, whether win or lose, you want to contact that jury. You want to see what resonated with them. You want to see, how they evaluated the credibility of those witnesses and see just what may have been weighing for their decision.
Caroline, I think we're definitely trying to get one of those interviews with a jury member, so we will keep you posted. Meanwhile, CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman was inside the courthouse as the verdict was read, and she joins us now. Katrina, thank you very much. Any more color you can give us? And also, we've been putting ourselves in the shoes of Sean Combs, but there's also the potential victims here. Are we getting any reaction from that side of the equation?
Well, I just stepped out of the courtroom, but I can tell you that Sean Combs was elated by this verdict. Even though he was found guilty on 2 counts, these are the lesser of the charges. They both carry a maximum of 10 years in prison. And as soon as this was read out, he began smiling. I saw him shaking his fist triumphantly under the table. He was putting his head in his hands. And he was making prayer hands over to the jury and thanking them over and over again. He was so relieved by this outcome. He turned around to his family and told them that he loved them. And at the end of all this, they're still debating. What he wants is to be released now. He's been in this detention center, and his lawyer is making a plea. He says now that he's not up against this RICO charge, this sex trafficking charges, which were the weightier of these charges, that he should be allowed to go home with some restrictions, with a bond. They're proposing $1 million backed by a few members of his family, and with restrictions that he be able to go to Florida, New York, and LA. But both sides are putting together proposals for that. So we're not done with this day. Those are going to be turned in at 1 p.m. But when Sean Combs left that courtroom, he turned around to his family, and there was cheering, there was clapping. He was hugging all of his attorneys. He was telling everyone he loved them. He had led them in a prayer this morning, actually, where he blessed the hearts of the jurors and where he prayed for this not guilty verdict. And he was absolutely triumphant when he left that courtroom today.
Katrina Kaufman for us with the perspective inside the courtroom. Let's go back to Drika Duncan, who's been our correspondent on this from the very beginning of the trial. And Drika, I understand you have a little bit more from what happened inside the courtroom in regards to potential prison sentence.
As far as the sentence is concerned, again, we're going to hear more at 1. But Katrina Kaufman did a great job because she's also been inside that courtroom just about every single day. Actually, she has been inside the courtroom every single day. Alice Gaynor, actually sent out a note saying that Combs turned around, kneeled down on the ground, and put his hands on his chair and prayed. As Katrina mentioned, just the fact that the courtroom erupted with cheering and applause and whistling. We know that I believe 6 of his 7 children are in that courtroom right now. We've been told that there will likely be a comment. But to your point, Tony, there are a number of people who've been part of this process who do not feel vindicated at this hour, who do feel like the justice system let them down. So it'll be interesting to hear what Doug Wigdorf perhaps has to say about the reaction from Cassie Ventura, because he did speak after she spent 4 days on that witness stand and talked about why it was important for her to get her truth out. But again, we'll wait to see what happens. But we are expecting the family could come out here at any moment. And, of course, we'll bring that to you. As you noted, there's podiums set up. So whether that is from the government's position or the defense, we expect to hear from some people later today.
But, Eureka, regarding the sentencing, this has still got to be a high-stakes and tense moment for Mr. Combs and all his family as well. We have this note here from Alice, I believe, inside the courtroom. The government still intends to seek what they call a lengthy prison sentence. Do I have that right?
Yes, that's it. That's correct. I mean, they've been fighting this case. I mean, Maureen Comey was very clear about the law, about challenges throughout this trial. And I think that they see this as their best effort to see to it that he does serve the most maximum time allowed, which I believe is 10 years under the Mann Act. And whether that would be served concurrently or consecutively, I'm not clear on that. But they're going to fight to try to make sure that he does not walk out of this courthouse, that he is not a free man. And that's really what it comes down to from the government's position.
Drika, thank you very much. Jessica, I want to go back to you on this question of the judge's discretion here. The defense said in these final moments inside the courtroom that Mr. Combs has been given his life back by this jury. But that may not be completely true, because this judge will hear arguments and be in a position to put a sentence down that is, if the government gets its way, quite lengthy.
Well, that's right. And we don't know exactly what quite lengthy means. Of course, we have up to 10 years here. And I suspect that the prosecution is going to ask for something above the midline, above 5 years. Obviously, the defense will be saying no time, that he's had pre-trial detention for years now, that this is more than enough. He's more than served his time. And so what typically will happen is there's a little bit more time between the verdict and the sentencing. Of course, now we have a split decision. We have a conviction on the less serious charges where, again, to remind everybody, it is possible, it is within the judge's discretion to say no prison time whatsoever. So what's the judge going to consider? Very briefly, as Caroline said, aggravating and mitigating factors. Is this a first-time offense? Yes. and the judge will essentially decide what is in the interest of justice. Is it possible that we have an interview from Sean Combs, sitting on a beach somewhere in 1 to 2 days? I think that is possible. Is it also possible that he's sentenced to at least a number of months in prison? Absolutely. And let's remember, even though today is a significant win for the defense, there are still 2 convictions on 2 federal crimes. This is not a full vindication of Sean Combs. And nobody wants to be on the receiving end of a jury unanimously concluding, again, that he did commit these 2 federal crimes.
Jessica, thank you. Let's go back to Katrina Kaufman, who's outside the courthouse. And Katrina, I understand you've had some contact with Mr. Combs' defense team. What did you learn?
So I left the courtroom with Mark Agnifilo. He is the lead attorney for Sean Combs, the one who gave that closing argument for the defense. As we walked out of the courtroom, he cried out really loudly, "Holy," an expletive I can't say on television. We then rode the elevator together, and he told me, in 35 years, I've never felt like I feel right now. I'm relieved that I'm not miserable, he said. I think they were bracing themselves, especially after yesterday, where the jury had made a decision on 4 of these counts, but not RICO. I think they were very concerned. Also, just to add a little bit on your conversation you were having, the prosecution said in court they are seeking a maximum of 20 years because there's a 10-year max per each of those transportation for prostitution charges. They also raised the fact that the sex and the drugs, all of these acts that we heard about, the violence, they say that conduct, even though he ultimately wasn't committed for it, is related to these transportation charges, to those convictions. They also pointed out that while he was under investigation and knew he was under investigation, he was continuing to commit crimes. And this is something that the defense has not argued against. They admitted to certain acts of violence, to certain conduct. So the prosecution is absolutely gunning for the max here. But Sean Combs also, when that verdict came in, he turned around to his family and he mouthed to them, "I'm coming home." So he is very hopeful that he's getting out of that detention center soon.
Katrina, really interesting stuff. Thank you very much. Once again, as we await potential remarks there, we will summarize the breaking news. We came on the air with Sean Diddy Combs, found guilty on 2 of 5 federal charges in his sex trafficking trial. The rapper was found guilty of transportation to engage in prostitution, but he was acquitted on the more serious charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking with this verdict. Combs could still face prison time. Our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7, your local news, and, of course, tonight on the CBS Evening News. Then at 9 Eastern on CBS News 24/7, there will be a 1-hour special, Sean Diddy Combs, The Verdict. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Tony DeCopel in New York City.
You've been watching a CBS News special report. As indicated by that special report, a jury reached a verdict in Sean Diddy Combs' sex trafficking trial. They found him not guilty on counts 1, 2, and 4. Those were racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking charges. They found him guilty of count 3 and 5. Those were the transportation to engage in prostitution charges. Chris Melcher, celebrity lawyer and former sex crimes defense attorney, is joining me now to keep the conversation going about this. Chris, first, let me get your reaction to the verdict.
Well, it is a huge win for Diddy, and obviously this jury was conflicted earlier on. We had heard about some really firmly held opinions by some camp in the jury, and then another camp feeling differently. And so they slept on it and came back and were able to reach a unanimous verdict. And that's what is required in a criminal case. And the way I see it is a compromise between the camp that probably was looking for a conviction on the sex trafficking or maybe RICO charges versus the other camp that felt that this was overcharged and he wasn't guilty of that. And to find agreement, they said, hey, let's go with the transportation charge that was clearly established and find him not guilty on the other charges. So he does have some exposure that we can talk about what that criminal sentence could look like. but overall a victory for Diddy Combs.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about what that exposure is and what kind of prison sentence he is looking at. Before you get to that, there was discussion during the special report that the judge may actually release Sean Diddy Combs, and there was talk that he could find himself, with a bottle of champagne on his private jet or on a beach celebrating what you just indicated is a win for him. Could we see that, and what kind of jail time, if any, is he looking at?
Well, Vlad, that is a very real possibility that he walks out that door today. And I think that that would be appropriate based on the outcome that we've heard from the jury. He was facing these very serious charges that had potential life sentence under RICO and sex trafficking. And the jury said he did not commit those crimes. Now, that's already been determined. And so all of these arguments that the prosecution had for keeping him in custody based on the severity of the crimes that he was charged with no longer hold water because he's acquitted of those charges. There's also the fact that he has no criminal history, that he has surrendered his passport. He's willing to put up a bond. There's no indication that he would flee the country to avoid sentencing or imprisonment, because the imprisonment sentence is not that long compared to what he was facing before. If he was facing life in prison, maybe anyone would run into those circumstances or have a motivation at least to do so. Here, he already has a lot of time in custody. So he's been in custody, which is unusual, by the way, for a lot of criminal defendants. They find themselves free pre-trial and only are committed after a verdict of guilty. So he served substantial time. Yes, there was witness tampering concerns that were real that also landed him in custody before, but those really don't exist anymore. The testimonies already occurred. The verdicts already happened, so there's really nothing to tamper with at this point. So to me, it would be appropriate to release him today.
Okay, and so when he does, if he is released, Chris, and he does come back for sentencing, what's he looking at?
So under those federal sentencing guidelines that the court looks at, they're not necessarily bound by. The maximum sentence for these transportation charges, 10 years. Now he has two counts that he's guilty on for those. Those generally are going to run concurrently, meaning it's not going to be served 10 years for count one and then 10 years for count two. So these would be run together. Again, the 10 years is the max. The minimum could be no jail time. Under the guidelines, when I was looking at the calculator, based on this level of offense and no prior criminal history, it could be 15 to 21 months of incarceration. And he's already been in custody since late last year. And so he gets credit for that time, plus for good behavior because he didn't have any problem in custody. So he could have already served essentially his sentence on the very minimal level based on the time that he's already been in MDC. And so that's something the court's going to have to consider. He definitely had a leadership role in this activity here, but we didn't have conduct involving minors. And so, again, based on no criminal history, we could be looking at maybe a 2-year sentence or less with credit that he's already served. And that's another reason why he might walk out the door today, because he's not facing the prospect of enough time for it to be realistic for him to flee.
And Chris, in just 30 seconds before we wrap it up here, how do you grade the prosecution and the defense? Of course, if you just look at the numbers here, it does seem like a win for the defense, but did the prosecution sort of drop the ball, or did they do the best that they could?
Well, the prosecution did a great job, but I think they overcharged it with the RICO. It just didn't make sense. He was an enterprise of one person. Everyone else worked for him or were following his commands, so that never made sense, and that may have turned off the jury. The defense did a good job in showing there were some consensual freak-offs here, but also I think had a hard time relating that these were some romantic evenings that I think, no, that went too far.
Yeah. All right, Chris Melcher, really, really fascinating insight there for us this morning. Thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it. All right, that does it for me, folks, but stay right where you are. Of course, the breaking news, Sean Diddy Combs, there's a verdict in that sex trafficking trial. He has been found not guilty of the most serious charges. Mugo Diwe will pick up our coverage live from San Francisco. This is CBS News 24/7.
Welcome in. We expect the House to start procedural votes ahead of Trump's budget bill today, but we want to bring you updates and breaking news into our newsroom right now. We are talking about the Diddy trial. This is a trial against Sean Diddy Combs. The verdict is in his trafficking case. It was a mixed verdict from the jury. Combs was spared of the most serious charge, and that charge carried a sentence of life in prison. But we want to start with the ruling here. He was found not guilty of racketeering, not guilty on count 2 and 4, which were the sex trafficking charges, but he was found guilty on counts 3 and 5. Those were the transportation for the purposes of prostitution charges. So you're looking right now at a podium right outside the courthouse, right there. We expect lawyers for Combs to give a presser there any moment now. That news conference will bring it to you as soon as it begins. But right now we want to get to CBS News national correspondent Jerika Duncan to give us much more information about this ruling from the courtroom, the reaction from Combs, his family, those outside as well. Jerika, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us more about the ruling, and I know you're standing outside. Tell us about the reaction, too, that you got once that verdict officially came in.
This is a victory for Sean Combs and his family. Sean Combs put his hands up to the sky. He had his hands sort of clasped as though he was praying, according to those who were inside the courtroom, and kneeled down. He was very emotional. There was cheering inside of the courtroom once this verdict was read. The issue now is whether or not Sean Combs will be able to go home until sentencing. That is being worked out as we speak. The judge adjourned and said that they would be back at about 1 o'clock this afternoon Eastern time to figure out whether or not the sentencing would start sooner, or whether or not he will have an opportunity to go home until their sentencing for the 2 counts that he was convicted of, the Mann Act. Now, that involved star witness Cassie Ventura, someone that dated Combs for the 11 years. And then you had Jane. He was also found guilty on that Mann Act. That was also someone that he dated from 2021 to about 2024. But the family just left. I believe it was 6 of his 7 children that were in 2 sprinters. You see one right here behind me. We're not sure. Looks like this one is leaving. But I can tell you from even where I was standing, I could see that the children of Sean Combs had a smile on their face. They took their time getting into that sprinter. Normally, they are in, they are out, they do not make eye contact, they have no comment. But today is different, and it's different because their father is not facing up to life in prison. He's still facing significant time, a maximum of up to 20 years, because each count of the Mann Act has a maximum of 10 years. And the government saying they plan to pursue the maximum. But it is definitely something that we saw in that courtroom. Based on those who were in there, we could see that there was a weight lifted off of Sean Combs because he was facing very, very serious allegations and crimes, but again, only found guilty on 2 of those counts, the Mann Act, that is the transportation to engage in prostitution.
And Jerika, just yesterday, we know the jury, they came back with a partial verdict, and they were going to continue deliberating this morning. It seems very quickly into that deliberation process, they came up with their final verdict, right?
That's right. And, you know, one of my colleagues, Elaine Quijano, said there's a lot of social science behind people being a little bit sharper in the morning and being more decisive. And I never thought about that, but it makes sense when you're trying to analyze, you know, why not go later yesterday at the end of the day if you only had an hour or less of deliberating before you needed to make that decision. And I think many of us were wondering if, because that racketeering conspiracy charge, which was very broad and very complex, a lot of legal scholars would describe it that way, especially considering a case like this that had to do with a criminal enterprise, a group being formed, being led by Sean Combs for his sexual desires. But it was, you know, you never know what the jurors are thinking, and that's why you have to wait for the results. So we could have said, well, maybe it means this or maybe it means that. I have to be honest, I think a lot of people are a bit shocked by the outcome. Some saying that they thought, a number of people I spoke to thought for sure he might be found guilty of sex trafficking on Cassie Ventura. But again, that is not what the jurors found. 8 men and 4 women who listened to 34 witnesses over the course of 7 weeks, making that decision this morning after deliberating for less than an hour on this Wednesday morning.
Yes, and what's next for Combs here? I know obviously this verdict is a victory for him and his team, but there's a chance that he is going to spend time in prison. So what's next for him, and how does this affect his legacy?
Well, you know, it will be interesting to see if he will. He didn't have a previous record, if you will. I believe the minimum is it could be probation on a Mann Act. So you're going to have to look at statutes. There's time served since he's been in the MDC since September of 2024. So I don't know what kind of time he is facing, but I think this is the best possible outcome that the defense could have asked for. Obviously, I'm sure they would have thought maybe not guilty on all of the counts, but they realized the serious nature of what their client was facing. The next step really is this 1 o'clock hearing where the judge will determine whether or not Sean Combs gets to go home free until his official sentencing, or whether they'll make that determination today.
All right, Jerika Duncan in New York for us. Very busy out there in the courthouse, as we would expect. Thank you so much for your reporting today.
Yes, thank you.
All right, let's bring in CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson for us. Jessica, thanks for your time. I want to know about your take on the verdict that the jury reached.
So I think this has to be seen as a big win for the defense. When it comes to the most serious charges, Sean Combs was not found guilty. And when it comes to those lesser charges of transporting somebody for commercial purposes, for prostitution, there were convictions. And we should be clear that these are still federal criminal convictions. And this is, it is still serious to be convicted of federal crimes. But in terms of the overall case and what Sean Combs was charged with, certainly this is a win for the defense. At this point, what we're looking for is seeing if bail, whether or not Sean Combs will be released essentially almost immediately, maybe today, or if he will be detained until sentencing. And then we're looking forward to see what sentencing is going to look like. The prosecution has said that they're going to ask for a very lengthy period of time. We don't know exactly what that is. The defense obviously wants no time whatsoever. And so we're going to look at there will be an exchange of memorandum where the prosecution will say, this is why we think that he should be behind bars for a long time. These are all the aggravating factors. The defense will say, here are all the mitigating factors, and we actually don't think that he should be behind bars for that long.
Jessica, I have to ask you, from your experience dealing with cases in your entire career, what are the chances here that he could actually walk free and not face any time in prison and only get probation?
So, well, obviously two different things, meaning will he be free prior to sentencing, and then will he get zero sentence, in the sense of will he get zero time behind bars? I shouldn't have said zero sentence. So I think it is possible. I will say it's within the judge's discretion. The judge will consider all of the evidence that the jury heard, and whether or not some of the evidence, which does paint Sean Combs in a troubling light, is related to the counts on which he was convicted. So I also think it is possible that we could see some minimal jail time. I do want to remind everybody that he has been in prison for a long time. There was, of course, pretrial detention in this case. And so even if he is sentenced to a number of months, it could be that the judge concludes, basically, you've already served your time.
All right, Jessica Levinson, we appreciate your insight on this case. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we're joined now by Chris Melcher, a former sex crimes defense attorney. Chris, we want to get your take on the verdict and the Sean Combs defense. It seems clearly his team very happy about the verdict here.
Well, Mugo, absolutely. I mean, this was the best that he could have hoped for. Under the RICO and sex trafficking charges, he could have been facing a life sentence. And under the charges that he was convicted of, or the jury reached a guilty verdict on, it really could just be probation. And so this was the best that he could hope for. I think that the prosecutor had probably overcharged this case with the RICO, where it's a criminal enterprise that we usually see applied to the mafia. And here, this was an enterprise of one man who was doing some really depraved things, but everyone was working for him and doing his bidding. It wasn't the traditional type of RICO case. So I don't think that really made a lot of sense to some of the jurors. And now this the transportation charge, okay, sure, so he's found guilty of that, but he's also served a significant amount of time in custody already, and it would seem appropriate that he could be walking out that door today.
And we were talking to one of our correspondents, Jerika Duncan, outside the courthouse earlier, and she mentioned that even when the verdict came down, there were some people out there who were surprised by it. Your take from your experience dealing with cases like this, were you at all surprised by this verdict?
Well, this is the thing about juries, they're unpredictable. But what we heard from the notes were that there were firmly held beliefs by some jurors and an inability to reach a verdict on the RICO charge, and somehow a good night's sleep allowed them to reconcile some of these things. And what we see is a compromise or negotiation happening in the jury room, because they do want to reach a unanimous verdict. They don't want to have the 7 weeks of their life go for nothing and have the victim and defendant have to redo the trial, which would have been the consequence potentially of a deadlocked jury. So they had to agree on something, and what the compromise is, hey, let's go for the transportation charge, guilty on those 2 counts, not guilty on everything else. And that does make some sense, because he will be held accountable for his conduct, but not at the serious levels that the government had hoped for.
And you talked about how this is a victory for the defense. Any chance that they will come back and try to basically appeal this verdict?
Well, sure, there can always be appeals, but he had a fair trial. There were lots of opportunities to cross-examine witnesses. He developed that information. The judge made appropriate rulings. So I don't think that there's any likelihood of a successful appeal. Had he been convicted on the RICO charge, maybe there could be something there. But on the transportation, that seemed to be firmly established by the testimony, that there were transportation of one or both of the victims and these other workers here that he retained across state lines. So that would be very difficult, I would think, to win an appeal.
Yeah. And I want to ask you, I want to go back to that racketeering charge, because from the very beginning, the question was whether or not prosecutors were able to make their case there, showing the jury that he is in fact or should be guilty for that charge. Why is it so difficult to get a guilty plea when it comes to racketeering?
Well, it has to make sense to the jury. These are not attorneys or judges. These are regular people who are just being instructed on the law and saying, okay, is this a criminal conspiracy? 2 or more people engaged in a criminal enterprise involving specific crimes. Well, that doesn't really fit what we saw here. This was a guy that, it's unbelievable the kind of things that he was doing. But it was really an enterprise of one. It didn't have the features of the mafia or cartel. So I think that just wasn't understandable. The prosecution did the best that they could in closing argument to explain it, but it was just a bridge too far. And the same for the defense, saying that these were somehow romantic evenings that we would all enjoy to participate in. No way. That didn't make sense either. So the jury had to kind of use their own common sense and apply that towards reaching a verdict.
And Chris, I know you cannot read the judge's mind when it comes to what's going to happen next, but there is that question of whether or not Sean Diddy Combs is going to be allowed to go home today. What's the possibility of that actually happening?
Well, I think that is a very real possibility, and the judge was signaling that and saying, hey, show me, prosecution, a case where somebody who's been convicted of transportation has even been in pretrial confinement for this long. And many people get out on bail and they don't have to suffer imprisonment or confinement before trial. He has no criminal history. He was acquitted of all these very serious charges that the prosecution made against him. He's going to put up a substantial bond. There's no risk of him fleeing when he's almost served the entire potential sentence already pre-trial. And the concerns about witness tampering don't exist anymore because the witnesses have already testified. So I would think that all signs, in my view, point towards him walking out that door today.
I also want to ask you about sentencing. How long before we officially know what the judge is going to decide on this?
Well, generally, they take their time on that. There's going to be pretrial interviews or pretrial services interviews, and looking at his history, the motivations for why he did these things. He can now explain, there was a drug issue, maybe there were other things going on in his life that made him engage in this conduct. So he would try and explain it as what we call mitigating factors. He would definitely advertise to the fact that he has no criminal history before. He's going to talk about things that he learned while he was in detention and why he'll lead a different path going forward. And the prosecutor is then going to want to put on these aggravating circumstances. So that may happen, let's say in a month from now. We could see a hearing on that. There's sentencing guidelines. This could go anywhere from no jail time, meaning probation, all the way to 10 years in imprisonment. The guidelines seem to be around 15 to 21 months of imprisonment, and he's already been in custody since September of last year and will get credit for that time. So he could potentially be sentenced to time served.
Okay, Chris Melcher, thank you so much for joining us today and for your insight on this case. Appreciate your time. Our team with CBS News New York is also on the ground, so let's take a listen to their coverage. This is from moments ago.
We did hear from the attorney for Cassie Ventura outside of court. Let's listen in to see what he had to say.
We're pleased that he's been held responsible for something, which is something that hasn't happened in his lifetime. And, we're hopeful that ultimately he receives a substantial sentence for what he's done. And, we're pleased that Cassie's brought to light everything that has happened in this trial. I just spoke with her and with the U.S. Attorney's Office team, and she's in a good place. She's pleased that, again, that the jury has found him liable, or guilty of 2 federal crimes.
And we were just listening to Douglas Wigdor, Cassie Ventura's attorney, who said he spoke with her and that she was doing okay. Now we want to go to Michelle Thomas. She is a trial attorney. Michelle, what was your reaction when you heard the mixed verdicts?
Good morning. I think that the prosecution, they failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Diddy was involved in this sex trafficking criminal enterprise. I think that with the more than 800, I believe, text messages with Jane and Cassie telling Diddy that they loved him, I think all of that cast what we call reasonable doubt for the jury as to whether these women were complicit and consensual or not. So quite frankly, because of the muddied waters there, it wasn't surprising that he was acquitted on the 2 most egregious charges.
When you heard there was a split verdict yesterday, what were your thoughts? What did you expect to hear today?
I expected to hear that there was going to be a guilty on one of the sex trafficking charges, which as it related to Cassie, because the jury was asking questions on the racketeering charge about the underlying predicate crimes that could have been committed. So I thought they must believe that there was some crime committed here and possibly the sex trafficking crime. But as we saw very quickly this morning, the jury came back and said, no, the prosecution did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed those 2 harshest charges.
So, Michelle, you were surprised when you heard the verdicts.
I was surprised because I expected, particularly with Cassie, because as we know, the video doesn't lie. We watched it. The jury watched the video where at the Intercontinental Hotel where Diddy dragged and kicked and physically abused and assaulted Cassie, where she was trying to escape one of the freak-offs. That lends itself to this sex trafficking charge where these women were forced to participate by coercion or force. That's the definition of sex trafficking. So that was a surprise, not in relation to Jane, but certainly in relation to Cassie.
Now, when it comes to the verdicts and those guilty verdicts on transportation to move sex workers, we hear about the sentence, 0 to 10 years. He could face up to 20 years in prison on these. Do you expect we will see him even serve jail time?
Certainly the defense is arguing for leniency. They're going to argue that he walk away today, certainly be released on bond to await sentencing. And then at the sentencing itself, the court has a decision whether to run the sentences concurrently or consecutively. But in this case, he doesn't have to serve any time at all. So I think it remains to be seen that they're going to weigh whether he's a threat to society, a threat to others, or a harm to others, whether he needs to be committed to a penitentiary for a period of time. But the court has wide discretion, as you mentioned, to order no time up to 10 years per crime.
And Michelle, let's talk about how double jeopardy plays with this case.
Well, there is no double jeopardy
Meaning, right.
here that he already.
Okay.
He can't be charged again for any of the crimes because he was acquitted on the racketeering charge, and he was acquitted on the 2 sex trafficking charges.
All right. Thank you so much, Michelle Thomas, trial attorney. Now let's go back to Jennifer Bisram, who is outside the courthouse with Alice Gaynor. Jennifer?
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Something that should have been told to me before I even came outside, but whatever.
All right, our thanks to CBS News New York for that report. And I want to remind you of the verdict that was handed down to Combs. He was found not guilty of racketeering, not guilty on count 2 and 4, which were the sex trafficking charges against him. But he was found guilty on counts 3 and 5. Those were the transportation for the purposes of prostitution. So let's get to CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman. She's been covering the story for us from the very beginning. Katrina, thank you for joining us. Good to see you out there. Kind of tell us about this verdict. What was it like in the courtroom or even outside the courtroom once it officially came down?
So I was sitting there in court when this verdict was read. One of the four-person stood up and announced, not guilty on a number of these charges, the most significant charges, RICO, sex trafficking. Sean Combs was just sitting there looking so relieved, even when the guilty verdict came down on these transportation for the purpose of prostitution charges. He was jubilant. He was smiling. He turned around to his family. Sitting behind him were all of his children and his mother in a first row and other friends and family in another. And he just said to them, "I'm coming home." He mouthed that. Then he kept making prayer hands and mouthing thank you to the jury members, to the judge. And then his attorney actually made a plea for him to be allowed to walk out of this courthouse today. He has been in detention. He has been away from his family. And they believe now that these bigger charges against him, the RICO, the sex trafficking, have not been found as convictions, that he should be allowed to go home as he awaits this sentencing.
And I know we are waiting because we showed a podium outside the courthouse earlier. We're waiting for a news conference. But have you heard anything from the prosecution or the defense about this verdict?
So I actually happened to walk out of the courtroom with Combs' lead attorney, that's Mark Agnifilo. He is the one who gave the defense closing arguments. And as we left the courtroom, he just yelled out, "Holy," an expletive. And then we rode the elevator down together, and I asked him how he was feeling. And he said, "In 35 years, I've never felt like I feel right now. I'm relieved that I'm not miserable." And I think they were truly deeply concerned about what this verdict was going to be, especially after last night's events. It's hard to describe quite how ominous it was in the courtroom when we got this jury note. There was thunder clapping outside. We found out they had decided on 4 counts, but were deadlocked on that RICO charge. And it seemed to indicate that there was at least some findings of guilt for them to even have such a debate over the most significant charge against Sean Combs. His legal team also, after that verdict today, they were all hugging each other. They were hugging Combs. There was massive applaud in that courtroom. Sean Combs' family was just thanking all of the attorneys and cheering for them. We also did get a little bit of reaction from Doug Wigdor. That's the attorney for Cassie Ventura, Sean Combs' ex-girlfriend, who was a key victim at the heart of this case. Her testimony was very significant, and she was tied to a sex trafficking charge, and then one of these convictions for Sean Combs of transportation for the purpose of prostitution was related to her. Her attorney, Doug Wigdor, was sitting in front of me in that courtroom when we got the verdict. He said that he spoke to Cassie. He says that she's in good spirits and that they are relieved that he has been at least convicted on some federal charges. They are disappointed that he wasn't convicted on the sex trafficking, but, he says there is the prospect that he could still be incarcerated for some time. There's the possibility of 20 years in prison here, and the prosecution just made it clear in that courthouse that that is what they'll be asking for.
Yeah, earlier you mentioned yesterday, and certainly, at least for me, when I heard of the partial verdict, I did think, oh, okay, maybe he's really going to get a long time in prison. And the verdict was very different because this morning, quickly after the jury started deliberating, it seems they reached a verdict on that last count. I want to ask about later this afternoon because court was adjourned, but they are coming back. What are we expecting when that happens?
So what happened was there is a debate now. Will Sean Combs be allowed to get out of detention, to walk out of this courthouse potentially today? His attorney says he should be able to. He proposed some terms to the judge. He says that Combs should be allowed to go back to his home at Two Star Island in Florida, and then also be allowed to go to New York and Los Angeles. They're asking for a $1 million bond, which would be backed up by at least 3 members of Combs' family, and then he thinks with those terms, Combs should be allowed to be freed. He also told the judge that Combs' private plane is in Maui, that his attorneys have his passport. They say he is not a flight risk here. But the prosecution, they feel very much otherwise. They think he should stay in detention. And while he's been convicted on the lesser of the charges here, they say that these are still very significant and that a lot of the testimony we heard in this case is tied to them. The violence, the drugs, this is still related to these transportation charges. They say this is very serious and they want him to stay in that detention center. So what the judge asked for is each side is writing a letter. They're going to submit those by 1 p.m. and then we will all be brought back this afternoon so he can make a decision.
Okay, Katrina Kaufman live outside the courthouse in New York for us. Thank you so much for your time today. I know you've been out there from the very beginning, so we appreciate it. All right, I want to remind you of the verdict that was handed down to Combs. He was found not guilty of racketeering, not guilty on count 2 and 4, which were the sex trafficking charges, but he was found guilty on counts 3 and 5. That's for the transportation for the purposes of prostitution charges. I want to bring back CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson. Jessica, does this verdict give you an insight into how the jury understood arguments from both sides?
Absolutely. And I think it gives us insights into juries even more generally, in the sense that whenever you see a split verdict, I think what we have to remind ourselves is that jurors don't just go back to that deliberation room and say, we like him, we don't like him, we generally think he did bad stuff. The jurors took this really seriously. They went count by count. They took each piece of evidence, all of the testimony, and they decided whether or not Sean Combs was guilty or not. Again, what we see here, I think, is the jury really parsing between the most serious charges where they were not able to find proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and then those less serious charges of transportation for prostitution, where they felt that the prosecution had proved their case. So I think it is a reminder that the jurors have a different job than most of us. They have a job where they have to put their preconceived notions aside, and they have to go in there and say, here are the instructions, this is the law, and is it satisfied based on the evidence that was presented to me? And obviously, I think overall, a really big win for the defense. But again, let's remember that we do have a conviction on 2 federal crimes.
Yeah, and Jessica, I want to go back to that racketeering charge, because as the case was going on, there was always that question as to whether or not the prosecution was doing a good enough job to prove it to the jury. Your thoughts, were you surprised that he was found not guilty on that charge?
Well, I think at this point I could say, oh, no, I wasn't. And I would sound really smart. Was I surprised? I guess what I will say is I was mindful of the fact that it's a difficult charge to prove, particularly in these circumstances. And so, you know, whether or not I was surprised, there was some reporting from inside the courtroom that maybe the jury wasn't buying it. That gave me some tea leaves to read. But it's a reminder that when you have to prove that there was a criminal enterprise, particularly in this type of situation where most people, when they hear racketeering, they think organized crime, that it's difficult for the prosecution to put all of that together. And again, it's not for the jury to say, I think it's more likely than not. The jury in a criminal case has to say proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So there were some allegations that the prosecution had essentially overcharged, and I think those people will feel vindicated today.
Yeah, it seems like they will. Jessica Levinson, thank you so much for your analysis. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
So our team with CBS New York is also on the ground, so let's take a listen right now to their coverage.
If you could see or take a look behind me and even hear, there are a lot of people outside of the courthouse now some supporters for Sean Diddy Combs who are chanting "Free Diddy," but just within an hour of deliberations today, that is how the jury came back today. Not guilty on racketeering conspiracy, not guilty on sex trafficking, but guilty on 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. Now, remember the racketeering conspiracy charge? That was a big one because we talked about this before. This was the charge that could have landed Sean Diddy Combs in prison for the rest of his life. And that is what the jury was deadlocked on yesterday up until around 5 o'clock. They came back this morning and they decided that he is not guilty on that charge. Mary?
Jennifer, can you give us an idea of what you're seeing there outside the courthouse? You gave us a little bit of an indication that you're hearing people chant "Free Diddy." Tell us about the scene right now.
So there are, of course, there's lots of media here, Mary, as you can see and as you may imagine. But if you take a look behind me here, you can see lots of people. They are just standing here outside of the courtroom. Some of them supporters of Sean Diddy Combs screaming or chanting "Free Diddy." Right now, you don't hear that. But at one point, that is what we heard. And I want to, Mary, if it's okay, to go back to a note that Alice has just sent us. The defense is currently arguing that they want him released, Sean Diddy Combs, and be able to return to his Miami home on Star Island. His plane has been chartered. It's in Miami. He does not have access to his plane. This is his first conviction. He should be released. His entire family is here. Any of them can sign onto a bond. The judge then asks, your proposal is he leave this courtroom and walk outside? The defense says, yes, I know there are things marshals have to do. He'd be permitted to walk out. That is my proposal. The judge says, is there application is for $1 million bond secured by 3 people? Defense says correct. Judge says he has relinquished his passport. Defense says we'll give to pretrial services. Want him to be able to go to Florida, LA, and New York. As you can imagine, the government opposes this application. So it's still unclear at this hour if Sean Diddy Combs will be able to walk out of the courthouse today and if he will be able to go back to his home in Miami at this point. But from these notes that Alice is sending, he does not have his passport. All his family is here, and that is what the defense is asking. That is the next step that the defense is asking for at this juncture.
Jennifer, when you heard what the verdicts were, what was the reaction? I know there's a whole lot of reporters out there. We have Alice Gaynor inside, a whole lot of reporters in there, but also the crowds around you.
Yeah, this has been a very populated trial, if you will. Since we've been here, since even jury selection began, there has constantly been a steady flow of people outside of the courthouse, even some in the courtroom. And there are some Diddy supporters, many of them saying that he should be freed and he should not be facing these charges. This morning, when we learned that there was a verdict, more people, of course, gathered. People got wind of it. And as we mentioned to you, Mary, people were saying "Free Diddy." And it got a little hostile at one point. There are cops here now just trying to control the crowd. But that is basically the scene outside of the courthouse. I think people are just waiting to see what happens next.
Okay, Jennifer Bisram, thank you so much for that update. We'll check back to you as we continue our live team coverage on this split verdict in the case of Sean Diddy Combs. Right now, we are joined by Nel Silvia Guzman, the executive director of Safe Sisters Circle. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us and help us break down what this trial means to survivors of sexual violence going forward.
Of course. Thank you guys for having me.
Let's talk about what happened on the stand. Cassie Ventura took the stand, gave deeply personal testimony. How critical was her role in shaping the jury's view of this case now that we know, too, that he has been found not guilty on those counts?
Yeah, I think Cassie's role was very critical. It takes a lot for a survivor to be able to tell their story to anybody, let alone so publicly in such a high profile case like this was, and even her own case that she had brought last year. I think regardless of the outcome, it really shows to survivors across the country that they can speak up, no matter the fame or wealth or the prestige that their abuser has.
Now, consent was a really big issue in this case. What is the difference between domestic violence, trafficking, and is that a hard question for a jury to answer?
I I think there are similarities across domestic violence and sex trafficking. With sex trafficking, you don't have to have the intimate partner relationship that you often see in domestic violence. You know, with this case, I think it did blur the lines a lot, and that might have been where, for the jury, they believed that the sex trafficking charges weren't, you know, to the standard of a guilty verdict. However, you know, even if at one point Cassie did consent to any of the freak-offs and dealings, you know, she made clear that at some point she didn't have the control or the power to say no. So at that point, there wasn't consent. And I think that's where, you know, even though, you know, many looked at it as a domestic violence situation, there were still the allegations of sex trafficking that were very relevant. You know, she was being moved from state to state and having to engage in these activities against her will.
And speaking on that, taking a look at those counts again, we have a guilty count in regard to transportation of sex workers. And I wanted to ask you, in this case specifically, do you see behavior that aligned with known trauma response patterns when it came to those who took the stand?
Absolutely. Especially with Jane Doe. I know they said with her testimony, there was a lot of just anxiety around her testimony and fear. And these are very common trauma responses. But for many people, they look at these as it may not be a reliable witness. But it's really just their trauma manifesting and the anxiety of having to face not only their abusers, but recount the horrors and what they had to deal with over and over again.
Now, based on your experience, is it typical for survivors to delay reporting sexual assault? And if so, can you explain what happens?
Absolutely. It is very common for somebody to delay disclosure. Part of that could be they don't even realize what happened to them was abuse or some type of, you know, there wasn't consent there. I think there's a lot of conversation still needing to be had around what is categorized as abuse, what abuse looks like. It's not always just the physical, very violent abuse that, you know, Cassie did experience, but for some people it's more nuanced and understanding that. And that's often why disclosure is delayed. But at any point a survivor comes forward is the right time, is what we tell our survivors. It doesn't have to be the next day. It doesn't have to be the next year. It can be years from now. As when you are ready to tell your story is when you're ready to tell it.
All right. Nell Sylvia Guzman, thank you so much for joining us. And now we want to go back to Mitchell Epner.
Okay, you have been listening to our team at CBS News New York as we follow this breaking news coming out of the courthouse in New York. We are told that Sean Diddy Combs has been found guilty on 2 counts of the sex trafficking trial against him, and he's found not guilty on 3 counts. Now, those 3 counts are the more serious charges, and those include sex trafficking and also racketeering. We have much more news ahead right here on CBS News 24/7. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
What happens when reporters take you inside the story?
I've been asking for over a year and a half for access into this place, and this is the first time we're getting it.
You get the all-new CBS Evening News every weeknight.
This is CBS.
This is NCIS. You put on that uniform, you agree to protect the person next to you, no matter what. Welcome to Australia.
Match made in heaven.
Watch out! Are you hungry? Shout you a crock burger.
NCIS Sydney. All episodes now streaming on Paramount Plus. Returns CBS Fall.
I'm Erin Moriarty of 48 Hours, and of all the cases I've covered, this is the one that troubles me most. Listen to Murder in the Orange Grove, the troubled case against Carsley Green, wherever you get your podcasts.
Be in the know, even when you're on the go, with the CBS Mornings podcast.
Some news you can use at the grocery store.
Better mornings start better days.
When you look good, feel good, you do good.
That's right.
Listen to CBS Mornings on the go on Apple Podcasts.
What happens when the world's best journalists come together?
Write a prescription for the healing of America.
We're retired and this is our paradise. Now it's gone.
You get the stories of America every night. You get the all-new CBS Evening News every weeknight.
I can only describe it as evil.
Follow and listen to Train to Kill, The Dog Trainer, The Heiress, and The Bodyguard on the free Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts.
My job can get dangerous sometimes, but I'm very good at what I do. I know you're scared. I'm here to help.
They said you were the best.
Your daughter hired me to bring you home. I made her promise I would never stop looking.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You hear about the reward?
Come in.
Okay.
Tracker, all episodes now streaming on Paramount Plus and returning CBS Fall.
Welcome back. We expect the House to start procedural votes ahead of Trump's budget bill today. You can see some lawmakers out there. We're bringing updates to you as they come into our newsroom. We also have our eye outside the courthouse as we wait for a potential press conference from Sean Diddy Combs' lawyers. He was found guilty on 2 of the 5 charges against him, not guilty on 3 charges, and those were the most serious charges. Now let's pivot to some big news out of Wisconsin, where the Supreme Court has struck down a nearly 200-year-old law dictating abortion rights in the state. CBS News correspondent Chanel Call has been following this story for us. Chanel, thank you for joining us today. Can you tell us more about this ruling?
Yeah, Mugo, good to see you. Good morning. This is a big reversal. In a 4-3 ruling this morning, Wisconsin Supreme Court's liberal majority has now struck down the state's 176-year-old abortion ban. That ban, if you do the math, was put in place back in 1849, essentially making it a felony when anyone other than the mother intentionally destroys the life of an unborn child. Today's decision, if you really water it down, means, Mugo, that 1849 abortion ban does not ban abortion. It means that 19th century state law can no longer be enforced. So elective abortion remains legal in Wisconsin now up to 20 weeks of pregnancy. This, Mugo, effectively upholds a previous lower court ruling that had reached the same conclusion. And this ruling, I should mention, comes about 8 months after the High Court had heard some oral arguments in the case late last fall. It stems from a 2022 lawsuit that was brought by Wisconsin's Democratic Attorney General Josh Kaul. So that suit, Mugo, was launched days after the U.S. Supreme Court, you'll remember, had overturned a national constitutional right to abortion. Wisconsin's Governor Tony Evers releasing a statement this morning saying, in part, thanks to our lawsuit, today's decision affirms that access to reproductive health care will continue to be available, helping ensure Wisconsin's women today are not forced to face firsthand what it's like to live in a state that bans nearly all abortions, even in cases of rape and incest. So again, Mugo, this ruling in Wisconsin now means elective abortion remains legal in that state for up to 20 weeks of pregnancy.
A very important ruling out there in Wisconsin. Chanel Call, thank you for walking us through it. Appreciate it. Now, there are some hopes today, new hopes, that there could soon be a pause to the fighting in Gaza. This after President Donald Trump said Israel had agreed to a 60-day ceasefire proposal. Trump is urging Hamas to take the deal, saying, quote, it will only get worse. CBS News senior foreign correspondent Deborah Pata is following developments from Jerusalem.
President Trump has said Israel has agreed to a 60-day ceasefire in Gaza, during which, and I quote, "we will work with all parties to end the war." The president also urged Hamas to accept the deal. Israeli sources close to the negotiations have told CBS that the U.S. is putting a great deal of pressure on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to agree to a deal before he meets President Trump next week. We also understand the Israeli military's chief of staff has told Netanyahu's security cabinet that their goals in Gaza have been achieved. For Palestinians in Gaza, a ceasefire cannot come soon enough after Israeli forces stepped up their offensive and the humanitarian crisis worsened. Every day there are reports from eyewitnesses and doctors who have told us Palestinians trying to get aid are being shot by Israeli forces who are investigating the incidents. Just this